Episode titled Old George. It was a normal morning. Everything in the pig family house was calm. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast in the kitchen. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. Peppa came downstairs and said hello. George was playing on the floor with his dinosaur. Everything looked the same as always. After breakfast, the family decided to go to the mountains. Daddy Pig said it was quiet and beautiful there. They drove up the road. There were rocks and wind around them. George walked nearby holding his dinosaur. He quietly said, "Dinosaur." Then he stopped. He saw a figure higher on the slope. It was standing still. George looked closely. It was him, but different. He had a small beard. His movements were slower. His gaze was calm and long. He held the same dinosaur, but it looked old and worn. George did not step back. He stepped upward. The figure stepped down. They stopped facing each other. The wind became quieter. The older George looked directly and said, "Dinosaur." The voice sounded deeper. George nodded. They stood side by side. The older George turned and walked higher. George followed him. They walked on the rocks. Sometimes the older George stopped and looked down. George stopped too. They reached a narrow path. It was quiet. The older George stopped. He looked at George and said, "You are not here yet." George did not answer. He just stood still. Then the older George raised his hand. George repeated it, but with delay. George looked at him. Now he seemed lower, as if something had changed. George stepped back. The older one stepped forward. Then he disappeared. In the evening, the family returned home. Everything looked normal. George sat and played, but sometimes he looked at one point. Peppa noticed this. At night, Peppa woke up. She heard footsteps. She looked into the hallway. George was standing there, but he was not alone. Next to him stood the older one, with the beard. He did not move. In the morning, everything looked normal. George was sitting on the floor playing. Peppa sat next to him. She looked at him. He smiled. Peppa looked at his dinosaur. It looked old and worn. Episode titled The Boy Behind the Glass. It was a normal morning. Everything in the pig family house was calm. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast in the kitchen. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. Peppa came downstairs and said hello. George was playing on the floor with his dinosaur. Everything looked the same as always. After breakfast, George walked into the hallway. He held his dinosaur and moved slowly. He stopped in front of a large mirror. He looked at it. At first, he saw only himself. Then he noticed someone else. Behind him, in the reflection, there was a boy. George turned around. No one was there. He looked back at the mirror. The boy was still there. He stood next to George, looking directly at him. George did not move. He said, "Dinosaur." The boy repeated, "Dinosaur." His voice was quiet. George reached toward the glass. The boy did the same, but his movement was slightly slower. George stepped back. The boy did not leave. He stayed in the reflection. During the day, George came back again. The boy was still there. He was closer now. George sat on the floor in front of the mirror. He played. The boy copied him, but sometimes he moved first. George stopped. The boy made another movement. On his own, George looked at him. He did not understand. In the evening, George stood in front of the mirror again. The boy was almost right next to him. He was looking at George. Then he quietly said, "Come." George said nothing. He just stood there. At night, George lay in bed. He could not sleep. He heard a quiet sound, like something touching glass. George looked toward the mirror. It was dark. But for a moment, it felt like someone was there. In the morning, everything looked normal. George walked to the mirror. He looked into it. It showed only him. George sat on the floor and started playing. He held his dinosaur. Then he looked beside him. There was another dinosaur, exactly the same. George looked up at the mirror. In the reflection, the boy was sitting next to him.